So on the left of this table, you can see we have our coping strategies. At the top, we've got approach and avoidance coping. And then it starts to get broken down into cognitive approach, cognitive avoidance, behavioral approach, behavioral avoidance. And then as we discussed, problem-focused and emotion-focused coping. Finally, at the bottom, we can see the psychological adjustment. But the first question is, how do these coping strategies influence adjustment? To do that, we need to look all the way over here on the right-hand side. Remember the standards that 2 asterisks means that it's significant at the 0.01 level and 1 at the 0.05 level. If we start by looking at the things that increase psychological adjustment, that is, the ones that have a significant positive correlation, approach coping leads to better psychological adjustment. On the other hand, avoidance coping leads to worse psychological adjustment. People who are trying to avoid the problem and not think about it, in the long run, end up feeling worse. If we look just at the cognitive strategies, we can see the same pattern. Cognitive approach strategies, like problem solving, making plans in your mind, lead to better psychological adjustment. Cognitive avoidance strategies, like wishing the problem would go away, or just not thinking about it, thinking about other things, leads to worse psychological adjustment in the long run. Behavioral approach strategies, where you try to actually fix the problem, leads to better psychological adjustment in the long run. Behavioral avoidance has negative correlation, although in this case, it's not significant. Both problem and emotion-focused strategies seem to lead to better psychological adjustment in the long run, which maybe mean that this distinction isn't that useful when we're trying to identify which strategies are most effective and which ones are not. So now that we know the coping strategies that lead to good adjustment, let's try to identify how the attributions play into these coping strategies and that long-term psychological adjustment. To understand this, we need to look at the note at the very bottom of the table. High scores on the attribution dimensions reflect internal, stable, and controllable attributions. So a higher score here means more internal attributions, and the locus dimension is negatively correlated with psychological adjustment. This means that people who have a higher internal attribution feel worse at the end of the day. However, if we look at the correlations between an internal locus and the helpful measures of psychological adjustment, there's a positive correlation between approach coping and internal locus of control. Similarly, this result holds when you break it up into both cognitive and behavioral approach strategies. There's a positive correlation between an internal locus and these good types of coping, remembering that these types of coping are the ones that lead to higher positive adjustment in the long run. It also leads to more problem and emotion-focused coping. So while this type of coping might make someone feel less good about themselves and about their situation, it does tend to lead to better type of coping in the long run. So let's have a look at stability as an attribution that may or may not affect someone's coping and their adjustment. First of all, we want to see, does the idea that a stable attribution for the health problem lead to a different type of coping as an unstable attribution? Remembering that higher scores here indicate a more stable attribution, looking first at psychological adjustment down the bottom, we can see that there doesn't seem to be a clear relationship between stability and their psychological adjustment. It doesn't seem to matter whether the cause is stable or unstable when we're trying to identify how someone's going to feel about their health condition. From the looks of this data, it would see that blaming something like effort or chance, which are unstable, doesn't seem to be that different for their psychological well-being as if you were blaming your personality or some sort of congenital problem. However, there does seem to be some information here about how it affects people's coping. A lot of these relationships are significant. Remember that approach coping is generally a good thing, it leads to better psychological adjustment, and avoidance coping is generally a bad thing, that leads to worse psychological adjustment. Stability here has a negative relationship with the good type of adjustment. This means that more stable attributions lead to poorer coping strategies. We've got a significant negative correlation here between approach coping, meaning that if you think that your health condition was caused by something stable like genes or your personality, then you're less likely to do anything about it. On the other hand, feeling that you've got an unstable cause of your health condition, something like your behavior or your effort, you're more likely to do approach-based coping. The opposite is true for avoidance, the less helpful type of coping. The less stable your attributions, the more you attribute it to things like effort, the less likely you are to do avoidance-based coping, which doesn't really target the problem. This pattern's the same when we look at cognitive strategies. If you think it's a stable cause for your health condition, you're more likely to say, oh, I'm just not going to think about it, and less likely to try and actively problem solve. Interestingly, Behavioral approach strategy, as in sticking to your health regime or maybe doing exercise, for example, is associated with a stable attribution. Problem-focused approaches are also associated with a stable attribution. And emotion-focused strategies are inversely related to the degree to which you hold a stable attribution. Meaning if you blame something like luck, which is unstable, you're less likely to take problem-focused strategies, you're less likely to do something to try to help fix the problem with behavioral approach strategies, and you're more likely to try to do things that are going to help you with the emotional response to that. These are kind of conflicting results. In some ways, stability seems to lead to more avoidance-based coping and less approach-based coping. You might say this is unhelpful. But when you look down through the moderators, this is not very consistent. It promotes behavioral approach, but not cognitive approach. Basically, if it's something that fluctuates on a day-to-day basis, you're less likely to do something about it, but you're more likely to try to deal with the emotional response to that, usually by avoiding it. Not thinking about those daily fluctuations, you might be less likely to try to come up with solutions. The jury's out on whether you want your attributions to be stable or unstable. However, based purely on the idea that approach-based coping is good and avoidance-based coaching is bad, it seems that unstable attributions are more likely to get us to approach the situation rather than avoid it. The picture for controllability is more straightforward. If you feel like you're in control of the causes of your health condition, it seems like you lead to higher psychological adjustment. And this is the strongest of the three effect sizes. Beliefs about controllability lead to more approach-based coping. You're more likely to do something to try to help manage your health condition. It also leads to less avoidance-based coping. You're less likely to try and run away from the problem and not think about it. This is especially true for cognitive approach, where higher beliefs about controllability lead to more thinking about ways in which you can try to fix the problem. Leads to better problem-focused coping and better emotion-focused coping as well. So generally identifying some ways in which this health condition is the result of things that are in your control makes you feel better about the situation, but also points you towards ways in which you can help fix it.